Okay, now we are recording. Good morning, everybody. Good morning, Maggie and Elaine and Monica. Today we are going to start one of the two webinar. The second webinar is with edX at 1 p.m. This one is our own, the Ocean Quest internal webinar, which is open to anyone. I'm talking about today is the coral handling standard of care. This is rarely a subject that anyone talks about in coral conservation. Before we start, if there is any audience that is not familiar with who I am, then I will have to introduce myself. My name is Anwar Abdullah. I'm founder of Ocean Quest Global. I started this journey in 1981. And about 13 years ago, I started an organization called Ocean Quest Global. I've written a few books about coral reef rehabilitation, coral propagation, and coral nursery development, and smaller manuals and guidelines for coral reef rehabilitation. In 2004, I invented the coral catalyst, which is an organic substance that is used in Ocean Quest Global Coral Propagation Program, whereby it allows us to create a fully organic coral propagation system. I am appointed as the edX Coral Reef Ambassador in 2013. And in the same year, the coral propagation system is also being introduced to a campaign called the Sea Shepherd Dive campaign. Then when the Sea Shepherd Dive campaign ended in 2018, the same year we started a collaboration with Thailand's Marine National Park Operation Center 3 in Trang. And we started the rehabilitation of Maya Bay. The rehabilitation of Maya Bay is a 4-year technological transfer from Ocean Quest Global to Marine National Park Operations Center. Then, towards the end of 2018, I started a conservation program in Magui Archipelago in Myanmar. And before that, we also in Indonesia, Maldives, and Philippines. And the initiative become a holistic conservation system that includes mangrove, seagrass, and forestry. Recently, I was involved in a blue economy and sustainability project in the coast of Arabian Sea. And through a partner in Egypt called Gabatech, we started Ocean Quest Egypt, and we established the first subtropical coral nursery in the Red Sea. Today, Ocean Quest Global have 2,569 trainers and approximately 26,000 trained volunteers at our disposal worldwide. So that concludes the introduction. About this presentation, okay, this is an overview of how Ocean Quest Global developed the coral rehabilitation based on best practices. And as a disclaimer, this is not a training program that will allow anyone to start handling corals. It is just an overview. I create and it cannot replace, this presentation cannot replace a proper training that is required for coral handling. Okay, the standard of care. What is the standard of care? Standard of care is a code of professional conduct that must be acknowledged by everyone in the prevention of abusive conservation. Without the professional code of conduct, we have no guidelines, we have no guidance on what is right and what is wrong in coral handling or any kind of handling in conservation. So to prevent ourselves as conservationists from damaging the corals or damaging the environment or make more damage than good in our work, we must have what we call the standard of care. The standard of care is a code of conduct that we must put up front before everything else. Because if we are not ethical in our practices, then everything in the condescending levels of the practice will be abusive, meaning we are creating more damage than good. So what is the standard of care like? The application of the standard of care actually is very broad. The standard of care is applied to all activity pertaining to the process of coral reef rehabilitation in this case. In other case of conservation, it is applied to the correct practices. So for example, forestry or mangrove conservation or seagrass or any kind of conservation of the environment, then they have their set of standard of care that must be written down and followed. So general standard of practice. General standard of practice means that if we see if we go to social media and we search for coral rehabilitation, we will see every kind of practices is done. People are presenting what they think is right and what they think is helping the ocean, what they think that is correct practices. But then the general standard of practice is that, first of all, the process and procedure must not harm one ecosystem in order to restore another. Example, if we need to break mountains, for example, to grind them to make concrete, and the concrete is used for conservation of ocean, that means we are damaging the ocean, the mountain environment, in order to restore the ocean. And that is not a professional code of conduct, because it is not a standard of care practice that one environment has to be damaged in order to restore another. Another general standard of practice is the handling of corals, for example, the handling of corals or the handling of plants or any kind of conservation. If we see the way that most people handle coral, and then if we compare to the veterinary profession, the animal doctors, for example, the way majority of coral handlers did not follow the standard of care like an animal doctor do. But then coral is an animal. We are handling it like a rock. We are handling it like an object. We did not handle it like a living animal. And therefore, the general standard of practice is broken at that point. then we are not following the correct standard of care. By right, if we want to handle corals, then we should observe what the animal doctors do when they handle our animals, for example. They wear gloves to prevent contamination. They have clean tools, clean equipment. They decontaminate the equipment, they sterilize them. They provide a professional level of care. Okay, so that means the general standard of practice is then followed at that point. And number two, coral extraction and collection. A lot of times that we think about coral conservation, people think size. People think of great size. They want to do 1,000, 1,000,000, 10 million corals if they can at a point. But then, if we need to extract corals, that amount of corals, 1,000,000 corals, for example, from a coral reef, it is not possible because it's just not available for us to collect the broken pieces unless we intend to break the living coral colonies, the healthy living coral colonies, and use it for our propagation. Then the extraction and collection standard of care, standard of practice is broken again. So therefore, we have to follow. That means coral extraction, the amount of corals taken, the size of coral taken, the type of coral taken has to be limited to what we can propagate and what we can cultivate, so that with the cultivation process, with the propagation process, when the coral grow, that will be a parent colony for us to multiply, and therefore it takes time. We cannot go to the reef and expect that we are going to do 1 million coral and we expect to collect 1 million coral from the reef. And then the standard of care to care for the marine environment, especially the coral reef, is broken. So to stay within the line of ethical practices, we must then limit the time, the number of corals, the size of coral. The size, for example, you can't just extract one colony from the reef. That's a lot of corals, right? So if you collect just broken pieces, how big? Is it 5 centimeter, 10 centimeter, 20, 30? What is the size that is not impacting the environment when it's collected, but yet allow you to multiply them and improve it later? Acclimatization and conditioning. This is another part that people don't normally observe. A lot of coral practitioners did not observe acclimatization, moving coral from one point to another to allow them to acclimatize to the changing pressures and temperatures, to allow them to adapt to the new conditions. Then again, it's time consuming. This is the part, most of the part that people break the professional code of conduct or the standard of care is because they did not have the time. They are rushing. They want everything quick. When they want everything quick, they must collect a lot of coral. They must take the coral from point A to point B ASAP, whatever. But coral did not have a schedule like you. Coral did not have a schedule like us. Coral have its own time of growing, of healing, of everything. Then we have to, if we want to grow coral, we have to follow what it needs to survive and thrive. If we don't have that time, we might as well don't even start, right? So propagation process and technique. Propagation, okay. What are the processes that we do? What kind of material we use? What kind of attachment? What kind of procedure? Do we decontaminate the buckets and containers that we use to contain corals during the process of propagation? Do we handle them properly? Do we observe that mixing of different species in a container will harm the coral because they sting each other? Those are the technique. And then do we wear gloves in the first place to prevent contamination or transferring of infectious diseases onto the coral that we are trying to propagate? Do we quarantine the coral before we decide to propagate them? Quarantine is a process, the precursor to propagation, because we need to know for certain the health condition, the state of health of that coral to be propagated. Otherwise, we will be wasting our time propagating something that's going to die, right? And then substrate. What kind of substrate? Is it natural or is it man-made substrate? Pros and cons. What's the difference between natural substrate and what is the difference of man-made substrate? What are the potential harm to the environment? Say, if I put a freshly mixed concrete block, freshly fabricated, that is like 10 days old, which is still smelling of the chemical, is still reacting, and then it is highly alkaline at that point. And when I soak them in the seawater, the alkalinity of the concrete surface, what will it do to the surrounding environment? Number one. Number two, like I said earlier, do we harm another environment in order to restore the ocean? Yes. If we do copious amount, a lot of substrate made of concrete, we need to grind and break a lot of mountains, limestone on Earth in order to put it in the ocean to restore coral reef, which I don't think it does its job at all. But if it does not justify breaking one part of Earth and to restore the other. Natural substrate, then there's a lot throughout the years in the process of cycle of living and dying in the coral reef. There's a lot of broken aragonite rocks. So can we use them? What is the advantage of them? In Ocean Quest Global, we only use aragonite rocks that is from the ocean. Why? Because it's already coated in biological coating, and therefore algae will not grow on top of surfaces that is already occupied by something else. Therefore, most of the time, the Ocean Quest Global System is free from maintenance of algae, basically. And any excess algae or any excess growth on the surfaces of the rocks will be taken up by our natural ally, which is the parrotfish and the rabbitfish. Therefore, our system will be more or less maintenance free. Yeah. So post-propagation care. What is post-propagation care? After the propagation, do we care for it? Absolutely. If we are doing gardening, we put our seeds in the nurseries and the seedling is growing. Do we care? Absolutely. Same thing with coral. Do we care for the growth? Do we care for monitoring? Do we care if our seedling topple over in our garden? Yes, we do. Same thing with the care and maintenance of the coral nursery, post-propagation care, we call it. And then only if we cannot provide post-propagation care, then we are not practicing the standard of care that is needed for coral conservation. Yeah. So the professional code of conduct must include all these guidelines, including the post-propagation care, and then to understand the threats of corals and its countermeasure, right? Threats to coral and countermeasure. a lot of people did not put effort in understanding. When they have a coral nursery, they are at the mercy of the ocean for sure. Like us in Ocean Quest Global, we are the same. But how come we manage to have more successful nursery than anybody else? Because we have research part of the team that is going to identify the threats and write strategies, countermeasure strategies, we say, on how to minimize. We cannot eliminate threats from the ocean. There is no way, because the ocean works 24/7. We don't get there 24/7. We get there once or twice a day, probably. Most nurseries, they get there once a month. That is even less care, right? So threats and countermeasures is part of the standard of care. If we cannot identify threats and minimize them through countermeasure steps, we are not taking the steps in the standard of care. So all of this part, from general standard of practice to how we extract coral, the coral collection protocols, the acclimatization and conditioning protocols, the propagation process, substrate, post-propagation care, and the threats and countermeasure must be in hand before we even consider coral reef rehabilitation. Okay, so that is the standard of care. It has to be upfront. It has to be before the practices takes place. It has to be defined what is do and what is don't. And then we have to comply to this. Why? Because when we comply to this, we comply to our own professional code of conduct. If we don't have a professional code of conduct, we just want to jump in the water, grab some coral and tie it on structures. That is not a rehabilitation process. That is totally have no guideline, no protocols, no, and therefore those kind of practices, we call it abusive conservation. A conservation that is more abusive than correct. Okay. So yeah, I hope you guys can see the screen. Yeah. Benchmark. So how do we benchmark? When Ocean Quest started, we don't have a benchmark. We don't have nobody to benchmark our process with, because nobody does write down the minimum standard that is needed to protect the coral from us, the conservationists, not to protect from anybody else, to protect from our practices. Then we have to create our own benchmark. What do we want in terms of good practices, the best practices that will then protect the coral from our own interaction? Then only we are allowed to go touch the coral, break the coral, whatever you want to say, fragmentation. Then only we will see during the process if part of it or any part of it that is unethical or incorrect, then we will then have to improve. That includes sterilization, limit exposure and size and volume of coral we take. We are running out of time. Adapting to regenerative and eliminating degenerative process. Regenerative means something that grow and continue to grow and not destroying any part of other environment. Then,
yeah. So I'm having a little bit presentation going on.
So control intervention. Control intervention means we don't go to the reef and say, oh, this is our reef, and then we will do everything that we think is correct to do it. So we have to control our intervention, because the reef, the coral, the reef belongs to the coral, not us. We are there probably just to speed up the process of recovery of any damage. We are not there to recreate, to build our dream garden whatsoever. So control intervention is important in benchmarking the standards of practice. Then establish and expand guidelines. Everything we do has to be written down as a guideline so that the next and next generation to follow. Well, to summarize this, then the standard of care must be administered in the beginning of all environmental training program. Complying to this standard, including sterilization and conditioning of tools and materials used, limiting exposure, size and volume, adopting regenerative and eliminating degenerative techniques, control intervention, establish and expand our guidelines. This can help eliminate abusive conservation practices and ensure better outcomes. Yeah, because the remaining time, there's 7 minutes and 31 seconds left. I'm actually open for questions. I will open 5 minutes for question if there's any question regarding this part. And as those who join late, I will then be able to send you the recorded part of this presentation.
I have a question.
Yes.
Hi, Sir Anwar.
Hi.
So about my plan of making another coral bed as preparation, if this if this nursery will thrive compared to the first nursery I made, is that ideal? Now, I had an idea a while ago about the volume that you mentioned. So I will still use the fragments collected in the area. But would it be okay if I that I will make temporarily 4 coral beds in the meantime, and will not I will not be pushy to to plant corals if there are no fragments.
Yeah.
But I'll make coral beds.
Okay. Look at it this way. You can prepare coral nursery beds if you have a lot of substrate. Like, for example, there's a lot of dead coral areas, and there's a lot of broken coral that is tumbling around in the waves or in the surf. It's moving all the time. Nothing is going to grow on it because it's not attached to the seafloor. So those pieces of substrate can be collected, and it is laid in a nursery bed. The reason you create a nursery bed is because when you pile a lot of rocks together, the friction between those rocks will stabilize them. If they are individually, they will roll around in the current, in the waves, and everything. But once you pile them together, the friction between the rock becomes a nursery bed. You can prepare that. But expansion is another story. Expansion is how much management do you put in your nursery? How much time do you spend in your nursery? Is that time, you have excess time now. You have a lot of free times. You manage your nursery well, and you have a lot of free time. That is the indication where you can expand your nursery. It's not that, oh, I'm going to build 100 nurseries. Yeah, after you build the 100 nurseries, and then you find out that you simply don't have enough hands and time to manage it, then it is not doing according to the standard of care. The standard of care means you have to build it gradually, and you only expand when you are capable of. And then the expansion means it will not degrade, meaning it will not, you will have the management going for exponentially as long as you want, then you can expand. So expansion of nursery does not mean, a lot of people doing corals, they are into this, I'm going to break the record, I'm going to be the largest coral reef rehabilitators in the world, whatever it is. But do you have the resources, the time, resources, people to manage it? That's important. If it's not manageable, it is same as not building anything at all. Okay, I think I answer your question to that.
Yes, yes, you did. Thank you so much.
Okay, I have 2 minutes left. If you have any question, I will be glad to use this 2 minutes to answer any of your questions. Okay, then if there is no question, I would like to say thank you for attending this webinar. It is a short one. It is recorded, by the way. So I will then uh, blast the recorded video to you guys so that you can view. For those who are late in joining, you can see the beginning part of my presentation. So thank you very much and hope to see
Thank
you
you so
again
much.
next soon. Yeah.
Yes.
Bye.
Bye.
Okay. I'm gonna stop video. And